I want to be clear about something before this story starts, because the title of this story sounds like something it is not, and I would rather tell you what it actually is before you spend any time imagining something more dramatic or more illegal than the truth. The ultimate price that her precious car paid was entirely a consequence of her own decisions, her own choices, and her own remarkable inability to read a situation that was, by the time it concluded, about as clearly marked as a situation can be. I did not touch her car. I did not arrange for anyone else to touch her car. I did not sabotage, damage, vandalize, or in any physical way interfere with her car or anything connected to it. What I did was considerably more satisfying than any of those things, because what I did was legal, documented, and built on 4 years of meticulous patience that paid off in a single afternoon in a way that was, in the vocabulary of people who appreciate precision, absolutely perfect. Her name was Christine Beaumont. She was my neighbor to the west at 14 Holloway Drive, and she had been making my life complicated since approximately 3 months after I moved in, which was long enough for me to settle in and start to feel at home, and short enough that I had not yet developed the full picture of what kind of neighbor she was going to be. The picture developed quickly after that. Christine was the kind of person who experienced other people's ordinary life as a series of provocations. Not because other people were doing anything wrong, but because Christine had a very specific idea of how the world around her should be organized, and she found it continuously, mildly outrageous that the world did not arrange itself to her specifications without being told. She had a car that she loved in the specific way that some people love inanimate objects, with an attention and a protectiveness that exceeded what the object's function would seem to require. It was a white Mercedes-Benz sedan, new when she bought it and maintained with obsessive care thereafter. She washed it herself every Sunday morning with a specific soap and a specific cloth and a specific drying technique that involved 2 separate towels of different materials used in a specific sequence. I know this because her driveway was adjacent to mine, separated by a low garden border that had been established by a previous homeowner, and the Sunday morning car wash was something I observed from my kitchen window while drinking coffee on more Sunday mornings than I could count. The car was her most prized possession. Anyone who spent 5 minutes observing Christine in her natural environment understood this. The car was what Christine cared about the most. I own a modest house on Holloway Drive that I have lived in for 6 years. I am a graphic designer, self-employed, working from a home studio in the converted garage on the north side of my property. My daily life is quiet, and when my neighbors are decent people, genuinely pleasant. The houses on Holloway Drive are close enough together that you are unavoidably in each other's awareness, which means that the quality of your relationship with the people next to you has a real effect on your daily experience in a way that is difficult to overstate. When the relationship is good, you barely notice the proximity. When the relationship is bad, the proximity is everything. My relationship with Christine was bad within 6 months of my arrival, and bad, in an escalating way, for the 4 years that followed. The first incident was about my recycling bin. I had placed it at the curb on a Tuesday evening for Wednesday morning collection, as was standard procedure on Holloway Drive. Christine knocked on my door at 7 p.m. that Tuesday and informed me that the recycling bin was positioned incorrectly. It was, she said, encroaching on the visual line of her driveway entrance and creating an aesthetic problem that she found unacceptable. She wanted me to move it 6 inches to the right. I moved it 6 inches to the right. She thanked me with the specific tone of a person who has achieved a small victory and considers the matter closed. That was the first incident. Over the following 6 months, there were approximately 11 more, each one involving some aspect of my property, my behavior, or my existence on Holloway Drive that Christine found incompatible with her standards. The recycling bin came up twice more. My car, a dark blue Honda that I parked in my driveway, came up because its color was, in Christine's assessment, too dark and absorbed too much heat and made the driveway area feel oppressive on hot days, which was a complaint I did not know how to respond to, and so responded to by staring at her for a moment before closing my door. My garden hose, which I coiled and left at the side of the house, came up because it was visible from her kitchen window, and she found coiled hoses aesthetically displeasing. A package that a delivery driver left on my porch came up because it sat there for 4 hours before I retrieved it, and she felt packages on porches communicated a message about the street that she did not want communicated. I dealt with all of this the same way for the first year, politely, briefly, without escalation. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. I find conflict unpleasant, and I avoid it when avoidance is possible. I understood that Christine was difficult, and I made a quiet decision to manage the difficulty by minimizing friction wherever I reasonably could without significantly inconveniencing myself. The problem with that approach was that Christine did not experience my accommodation as the peaceful coexistence I intended it to be. She experienced it as confirmation that her interventions were appropriate and effective. Every time I moved the recycling bin or brought the package in promptly or adjusted something she objected to, she registered it as a successful assertion of her standards, and the standards got more specific, and the interventions came more frequently. By the end of year one, she was knocking on my door approximately once a week. By the middle of year two, it was twice a week. The complaints had expanded from my property to my behavior, the time of day I mowed my lawn, the music I played in the studio, the hour at which I turned on outdoor lights, the specific variety of flower I had planted in the front bed, which she felt was too informal for the street's aesthetic. The flowers were the one that changed my thinking. She knocked on my door on a Saturday in May of my second year and told me that the black-eyed Susans I had planted in my front garden bed were not appropriate for a street of Holloway Drive's character, and that she would appreciate it if I replaced them with something more formal. I looked at her. I looked at my black-eyed Susans, which were healthy and well-established, and which I had selected specifically because they attracted pollinators and were low maintenance and made me happy every time I looked at them. Then I looked at Christine again. I said no. She blinked. I said no, I was not going to replace my flowers, and that I was done adjusting things on my property in response to her preferences, and that I would appreciate it if she would confine her communications with me to matters that were governed by actual rules rather than by her personal aesthetic opinions. She stared at me for a moment, then she said she saw, and she left. The knocking on my door stopped. The complaints delivered verbally stopped. What replaced them was something different, and I came to understand over the following months, considerably more organized. Christine had decided to fight differently. She had decided to use the neighborhood's institutional structures, such as they were, to apply pressure that her direct interventions had failed to apply. Holloway Drive was not part of an HOA. There was no formal governance body for the street, no dues, no guidelines beyond the city's municipal code. What there was, however, was a block association, a loose, voluntary neighborhood organization that had existed for about 12 years and that organized the annual block party, coordinated the holiday decoration contest, and occasionally addressed neighborhood concerns at city council meetings. The block association had a board of 3 people and held quarterly meetings in someone's living room. Christine joined the block association within 2 months of our conversation about the flowers. By the end of that year, she was on the board. By the start of my 3rd year at the house, she was the board chair. I want to acknowledge, in the interest of fairness, that Christine was an effective block association chair in certain ways. She organized the block party more efficiently than it had been organized before. She got 2 long-deferred streetlight repairs addressed by the city. She improved the communication system, a neighborhood app through which residents could share information and concerns, and got most of the street signed up for it. These were genuine contributions, and I did not dismiss them. She was also using the block association, and specifically the neighborhood app, as a platform for a campaign of social pressure against me that was more sophisticated than her previous direct approach, and considerably more difficult to address directly. The neighborhood app allowed members to post observations, concerns, and questions to the full group. Christine used it regularly and skillfully. She did not post about me by name. She posted observations that were clearly about my property and my behavior without naming me, framed as general neighborhood concerns. A post about the importance of maintaining consistent lawn mowing schedules, posted 2 days after I had let my lawn go a week longer than usual because of a client deadline. A post about how delivery package accumulation on porches sent a message about the street's character, posted 4 hours after a delivery appeared on my porch. A post about the value of color coordination in front garden plantings, posted during the week my black-eyed Susans were at peak bloom. None of these posts named me. None of them were actionable in any direct sense. They were entirely deniable as general observations, but the timing was never coincidental, and anyone paying attention, and several neighbors were paying attention, could see the pattern. I received 2 private messages from neighbors over a period of 6 months suggesting, gently, that they thought some of Christine's posts might be about me and asking if everything was okay between us. I said everything was fine and that I appreciated them reaching out. I started keeping a log, not of anything dramatic, a simple dated record of every interaction with Christine, direct or indirect, that I thought was relevant. Every post on the neighborhood app that I believed was targeted at me, with the date, the content, and the specific correspondence to something on my property or in my behavior. Every time she photographed my property from the street, which she began doing in year 3, standing at the edge of the public sidewalk and photographing my front yard and driveway with her phone, presumably to document whatever she was planning to document. Every time she spoke to a neighbor about me, which I knew about because 3 different neighbors told me about 3 different conversations over the course of about 8 months. The log was meticulous. I am a designer, which means I am organized by professional necessity. I dated everything, I described everything precisely, and I noted the context. By the end of year 3, I had a document that was 22 pages long, single-spaced, covering 38 months of interactions. I showed it to exactly one person, my attorney, a man named David Reese, who I consulted in my 3rd year when Christine's activities had escalated to the point where I wanted professional guidance. David reviewed the log. He said the pattern was clear and that Christine's conduct, while not immediately actionable in most specific instances, constituted a documented pattern of harassment that would be relevant in a number of possible legal contexts. He said the most productive immediate use of the documentation was not a lawsuit. The individual incidents were too minor to make litigation cost-effective, but that the documentation was valuable insurance against whatever Christine was building toward, because people who conduct campaigns of this kind almost always eventually overreach, and when they overreach, the documentation of the pattern that preceded it becomes very powerful. He said to keep logging and to be patient. I kept logging and I was patient. The overreach came in the 4th year. Christine had, over the previous 6 months, been doing something I was aware of, but had not fully tracked until David pointed it out. She had been systematically photographing my driveway and the area immediately in front of my house, specifically the strip of public parking along the curb. She had been doing this on a schedule. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, approximately 9 a.m., she would walk to the edge of the sidewalk adjacent to my property and photograph the curb area, sometimes also the driveway. I had seen her do this multiple times and had logged each instance. I had not understood the purpose until David, reviewing the logs, pointed out that the Tuesday-Thursday schedule corresponded with alternate side parking restriction days on Holloway Drive. Holloway Drive had an alternate side parking ordinance, a city regulation requiring that on specific days, vehicles parked on the street had to be moved to allow for street cleaning. The restriction operated on a Tuesday-Thursday schedule on the west side of the street. My side of the street was the west side. I had a guest parking space at the curb in front of my house that I used occasionally and that, when I had guests, they used. Christine had been photographing the curb in front of my house on Tuesday and Thursday mornings because she was looking for a vehicle in the restricted zone, and she was going to report it to the City Parking Enforcement Office. David said this was within her rights as a citizen. Reporting parking violations to the city was a legitimate activity, but he said the pattern of systematic surveillance for the purpose of generating a complaint was relevant to the documented harassment context and that I should continue logging. I understood now what she was waiting for. She was waiting for me to have a guest who parked at the curb and did not move the car on a Tuesday or Thursday morning. Or she was waiting for me to park there myself and forget about the restriction. I did not give her that. I was careful. I noted the restriction days on my calendar and I reminded guests. For 4 months, nothing happened. Then on a Thursday morning in September, Christine made an error, a significant one. She came to photograph the curb at her usual time, approximately 9 a.m., and she found a vehicle parked in the restricted zone. She photographed it, and she called the city parking enforcement line, and she reported it. The vehicle was a silver-gray sedan that she apparently believed was mine or belonged to a guest of mine because it was parked in the curb space in front of my house. The vehicle was not mine. It did not belong to any guest of mine. It was Christine's own Mercedes, which she had parked the previous evening in the curb space in front of my house because her driveway was blocked by a furniture delivery she was expecting and she had not wanted to park further down the street. She had parked it there at approximately 6 p.m. on Wednesday evening and had gone inside and had not moved it overnight. She had spent 4 months photographing the curb in front of my house looking for a parking violation to report. On Thursday morning in September, she found one. She reported it. The vehicle that got ticketed was her own Mercedes. I know this sequence of events with certainty because of 3 things. First, I was in my studio at 9 a.m. on that Thursday, and I saw Christine come to the sidewalk with her phone and take photographs and then make a call. Second, I saw the city parking enforcement officer arrive approximately 45 minutes later and examine the vehicle and place a ticket on it. Third, I saw Christine come out of her house approximately 20 minutes after the officer left, walk to the vehicle, reach for the ticket on the windshield, and stand very still for a moment in the specific posture of a person who has just understood something that is not good. I documented all of this in my log. The ticket was $115. I know this because the city's parking violation schedule is public and the alternate side violation on Holloway Drive was listed at that rate. But the ticket was not the ultimate price. The ticket was just the beginning of it. I want to be precise about what happened after Christine ticketed her own car, because the sequence matters and each element of it connects to the ones before and after in a way that makes the whole thing coherent rather than just a collection of unfortunate events. Christine stood at her car for about 2 minutes after finding the ticket. Then she went back inside. I assumed she was going to move the car at that point because the alternate side restriction window ended at 11 a.m. and after that the vehicle was legal to park where it was. I watched from my studio window. I was working. The window faces the street. I was not specifically watching her, but I noticed what was happening the way you notice things in your peripheral view, and the car did not move. At approximately 11:15, after the restriction window had ended, a second city vehicle arrived on the street, not the parking enforcement officer. A different vehicle, a public works truck with a street cleaning attachment, the street sweeper. The sweeper came down the west side of the street cleaning the gutter. When it reached Christine's Mercedes, it could not pass because the car was partially over the line of the street cleaning path. The operator stopped, noted the obstruction, called it in, and within approximately 25 minutes, a tow truck arrived. Christine's Mercedes was towed. I want to be clear again that I had nothing to do with this. The street sweeper operated on its schedule. The tow was a consequence of the obstruction. Christine had parked her car in the wrong place at the wrong time and had not moved it when the restriction ended, which meant it was still in place when the sweeper came through. The sequence of events from parking to ticket to tow was entirely a product of Christine's own actions on that single Thursday morning. The tow truck left with the Mercedes at approximately 12:10 p.m. Christine came out of her house at 12:30, presumably to move the car, and found empty curb. I was at my studio window when this happened. I saw her come out. I saw her look at the empty space where her Mercedes had been. I saw her stand there for a moment with an expression that I cannot describe precisely. except to say that it was the expression of a person encountering a result they did not expect from actions they did not fully think through. Then she went back inside. I made a note in my log: date, time, description, clean and factual. The impound fee I later calculated from the public fee schedule for the city's contracted towing service was $180 for the tow plus $25 per day for storage. The total cost of retrieving the Mercedes that day, including the original parking ticket, was $320. Christine retrieved the car that afternoon. I know this because the Mercedes was back in her driveway by 4 p.m. I made a note. Now, the reason I am telling you the story of Christine ticketing and towing her own car is not purely because it is satisfying, though it is satisfying in a way that I will not pretend otherwise. The reason I am telling it is because of what happened the following week, which was when the documentation I had been building for 3.5 years became relevant in a way that resolved the situation more completely than the self-inflicted ticket and tow ever could have on their own. 3 days after the Thursday incident, I received a letter from a city attorney's office. Not a complaint letter, not a legal summons, a notice that a civil nuisance complaint had been filed against me with the city by a resident of Holloway Drive. The complaint alleged that I had been systematically engaging in behavior that constituted a nuisance to neighboring properties. Specifically, that I had been encouraging or facilitating improper parking in front of my property that obstructed street cleaning, that I had maintained my property in a manner that created visual blight on the street, and that I had engaged in a pattern of behavior intended to harass and intimidate neighboring residents. I read this letter twice, then I called David Reese. David read the letter and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the particular tone of an attorney who has just been handed a gift, that Christine had made a very specific error of judgment. She had filed a formal civil nuisance complaint against me with the city, which meant that the city would now conduct a formal review of the complaint's merits, which meant that I was entitled to respond with documentation, which meant that 22 pages of detailed logs covering 38 months of her conduct were about to become part of a formal public record. David said he needed 3 days to prepare the response. The response he prepared was 54 pages. It included the full 22 pages of my logs, annotated with contextual notes. It included copies of 19 neighborhood app posts that I had screenshotted with dates and the corresponding log entries describing what on my property or in my behavior each post corresponded to. It included a statement from 3 neighbors who had been willing to provide written accounts of conversations in which Christine had spoken to them about me in ways they considered inappropriate. It included David's legal analysis of how the documented pattern constituted a sustained campaign of harassment and intimidation, and it included a formal countercomplaint alleging that the nuisance complaint itself, filed in the context of the documented history, constituted an abuse of the civil complaint process. David submitted the response to the city attorney's office by certified mail and hand-delivered copies to the city council member for our district and to the city's community standards office. The city attorney's office reviewed the response over the following 3 weeks. I received a letter at the end of those 3 weeks stating that the civil nuisance complaint filed against me had been reviewed and found to be without sufficient merit to proceed and was being dismissed. The letter also noted that the city attorney's office had reviewed the counter-complaint and was referring the matter to the Community Standards Office for further review. David called me when he received the same letter. He said it was about as clean an outcome as he had expected. He said the referral to Community Standards was meaningful because the Community Standards Office had authority to issue formal warnings to residents who filed demonstrably bad faith complaints, and that such a warning, once issued, became part of the public record. I asked how long the Community Standards Review would take. He said 4 to 6 weeks typically. It took 5 weeks. I received a copy of the Community Standards Office's finding, which was addressed to Christine and copied to me as the subject of the original complaint. The finding stated that the civil nuisance complaint filed by Christine Beaumont against me had been determined to be without factual basis and had demonstrated characteristics consistent with an abuse of the complaint process, specifically the filing of a complaint in the context of a documented pattern of targeted harassment of the subject. The finding issued a formal warning to Christine that further filing of complaints determined to be without merit would result in additional sanctions, including potential referral for civil penalty proceedings. The finding was a public record. David had anticipated that Christine would be aware of the public record nature of the finding and would understand what it meant for any future complaints she filed. He was right. After the finding was issued, Christine did not file any further complaints against me. The posts on the neighborhood app that corresponded to my property stopped. The Tuesday and Thursday morning photography sessions at the curb in front of my house stopped. The knock-on-the-door interventions had been gone for 3 years by this point. The passive-aggressive app posts were now gone. The systematic parking surveillance was gone. What remained was a neighbor who lived 30 feet from my front door and who was, after 4 years of sustained effort to make my life difficult, reduced to simply living in her house and going about her business without my property and my behavior being the organizing principle of her week. I found that I did not experience this as a dramatic change. It was, in the practical texture of daily life, a quiet change, the absence of something that had been present for a long time. The Sunday morning car washes continued. The Mercedes sat in her driveway, clean and white, and maintained with the same obsessive care as always, repaired from whatever cosmetic damage the towing had caused, its owner presumably sadder and wiser about the risks of parking in alternate side zones on streets you have been surveilling. I watered my black-eyed Susans. About a month after the community standards finding, a neighbor named Helen, who had been on Holloway Drive for 20 years, stopped me on the sidewalk on a Saturday morning. Helen was the kind of neighbor that every street has if it is lucky, observant, fair, genuinely interested in the people around her without being intrusive. She said she had heard something about a complaint and a finding and that she hoped things were settling down. I said they were. She said she was glad and that she wanted me to know she had always thought I was a good neighbor. I thanked her. She went back to her garden. My log, which I had maintained for 3.5 years, with the precision of a person who understands that documentation is a form of patience. I closed on the day the community standards finding arrived. I did not delete it. I printed a clean copy and filed it. The file sits in my home office in a labeled folder in the second drawer, exactly where documents that might someday be needed should sit. I do not expect to need it, but I know where it is. The lessons I took from 4 years of this experience are not complicated. The first is that accommodation, when extended to the kind of person who interprets accommodation as permission, eventually requires a boundary. The sooner the boundary is set clearly, the less accommodation you have to reverse. I should have said no to Christine about the flowers in year 1 rather than year 2. I did not know that yet in year 1. I know it now. The second is that documentation is everything, not because the world is always fair or because documentation always wins, but because when you have it and the other person does not, the gap between what is claimed and what is true becomes impossible to bridge. Christine spent 4 years constructing a version of events in which I was the problem, and she was the reasonable party asserting reasonable standards. My documentation was a 4-year record of what had actually happened, date by date, incident by incident, and when those two versions were placed side by side in front of a formal review process, there was no contest. The third lesson is about patience. Genuine patience, not the passive tolerance that I practiced in year 1 when I was moving the recycling bin 6 inches and telling myself it was easier than conflict. Real patience is active. It is the patience of keeping a log and keeping it carefully and trusting that the record you are building will matter when the time comes. That kind of patience is not waiting, it is preparing. And the difference between waiting and preparing is the difference between being surprised when the moment arrives and being ready for it. Christine's car paid the ultimate price, not because I arranged anything or planned anything or got lucky. It paid the ultimate price because Christine had spent 4 years in a pattern of behavior that she had never examined from the outside, never considered how it looked or what record it was accumulating. And when she finally made the mistake that brought the pattern into the light of a formal process, the light was very bright, and the record was very long, and there was nowhere comfortable to stand in it. Her Mercedes is still in her driveway. She still washes it on Sunday mornings with the specific soap and the 2 specific towels. From my kitchen window, while I drink my coffee, the Sunday morning car wash is as regular as it always was, and the car is as white and well kept as it has always been. I drink my coffee, I look at my black-eyed Susans, which have spread slightly since I planted them and are approaching the sort of established, settled look that plants get when they have been somewhere long enough to know they belong. Then I go to my studio and I work. The street is quiet. The neighbor to my west is in her driveway with her soap and her towels. Everything is exactly where it belongs. I am very good at being patient when I know what I am being patient for. Thumbnail text. Line 1, she harassed me for 4 years and then accidentally ticketed and TOWED her own precious Mercedes face automobile. Line 2, then my 22-page evidence file destroyed her complaint and gave her a permanent city warning.